My name is Rebecca Dupas. I proudly represent Mansur, Louisiana. My spirit animal has to be a lioness. I think about her job in leading the pride, and in many ways I can relate to that.
Why do you relate to the lioness?
Well, Lucky, it's hard for me not to think about Sarabi in The Lion King. And even though in this animated, story, Scar takes over the pride, her husband, or the pride's husband, is murdered, right? But she's left to maintain whatever strength she has, whatever dignity she can find in the situation around her. And I can think of so many ways in my life where I've had to stay focused and even pretend strength in order to overcome something. So, lioness, Rebecca Dupas.
What are some of the things that you are focused on right now?
Right now, in this weird and unprecedented time, I'm so tired of that terminology, but it is actually a very weird and unprecedented time, right? So I have to respect that. I'm focused on my job in a very overwhelming way. I am one of those artists who also has a 9-to-5. So during the day, I'm an educator. I'm a museum educator. And much of my time is trying to figure out how to harness what I can in this virtual world to still do my job and still connect with people and still teach people. So I'm very much focused on my work in an overwhelming way. But in addition to that, I am editing a novel that I wrote. And I'm also continuing to figure out ways to reinvent myself. I started doing poetry a long time ago. There's a lot of new faces that I need to meet, a lot of people who I would love to introduce myself to. And I really want to make sure that my voice is still relevant. So not forcing it, but when ideas come, I'm still writing, I'm still practicing, I'm still revising, I'm still trying to make sure that I'm presenting quality material when I do speak. So work, creative writing, poetry, ring making, and learning how to cook more meals in this weird and unprecedented time where I'm forced to love on myself in a new way,
Yeah, what's your favorite meal right now to make in the house?
Even though I've explored some new things, my fallback is pasta, so just give me some marinara sauce, give me some ground turkey, give me some penne noodles, and life happens.
That's beautiful. You said that now is like a weird and unprecedented time, and you're having to focus on how to use our virtual lives and put it into the work that you do. What is your area of museum education?
So I am essentially teaching how and why the Holocaust happened. That is my primary goal. My audience, though, are youth. And so where I started off working with DC area schools, because I'm a former classroom teacher, right now I'm focusing on how to engage college students who are already sort of overwhelmed in finding out who they are and I guess attaching themselves to different organizations and goals that are very, I guess, unique to who they are as people, finding a way to sort of pause them and to teach them the lessons of a history that have proven to be very profound in helping us to understand the responsibility that we have to one another.
What are some of the hardships that you found in communication with your students as an educator?
Specifically to the Holocaust or just in general?
In general.
I think I'm one of those rare people nowadays that don't have a story of struggle with like teaching young people. Like I've always found them to be interesting projects, if you will, not to dehumanize them, but just the idea of I have a group of people who may or may not want to be here, who may or may not value whatever expertise I'm bringing to the room, and what is it that I can do to encourage them to listen, not really necessarily thinking about I guess how they hinder the process, if that makes sense. So my challenges really are beyond the students, and I start to think about what other education they've been given or what type of teaching style they've been introduced to and how that might help or hurt what it is that I'm trying to do in the moment.
So you lesson plan before you go in, definitely. That's what it sounds like anyway.
Yeah, I think it's important to have a plan, but I think that outside of building a lesson plan, whether we're talking about Holocaust education or I was a former English teacher, that I have to be open to veering from that path to make space for the way that they need to receive the information or the conversations that they need to have in order to unblock what might be stopping them from receiving the message that I want to give them.
What are some of the messages that you've been teaching lately? Like in our new virtual found world, like what are some of the things you guys have been able to talk about and communicate and connect through?
So right now in my work responsibilities, one of the key conversations that I'm having is about conformity and people's tendency to go along with the group, using the Holocaust as an anchor for that conversation, and what happens when we stop questioning ourselves and stop questioning what people desire of us, like that dangerous space where we aren't really thinking for ourselves or even thinking about how our behavior is going to impact someone else today, tomorrow, and in the future.
This seems like you take time to challenge yourself, like mentally. Yeah. Do you get an opportunity to write these challenges down or to write down your thought processes when you're questioning yourself in this way?
I think it's impossible, certainly, for me not to question myself and trying to tell people the importance of questioning themselves. So I do question myself, but it's more of an internal thing. I think that I've not necessarily written it. It hasn't come in a story. It hasn't come in a poem. More so just in reflection, if that makes sense. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, you did. You totally did. Because now I want to know if your poems don't necessarily reflect those internal questions, what does your poetry represent?
So my poetry doesn't reflect the internal questions that I have around the work that I do with the Holocaust and Holocaust education, not directly, but the reflections that I have over my life, the personal things that I experience, just like the poem Change Soon to Come. That is me processing what's closer to me, my more immediate experiences, so that I can find a better way to deal with them. So while I don't always reflect on my work at the museum and my poetry, certainly reflection is a large part of poetry in general. And it more so, comes out with those experiences that are more immediate to me, as with the poem Change Soon to Come, and how I'm reflecting on the murder of Black and brown people by police, or specifically with poetry, relationship poetry. I don't necessarily write love poems or erotic poems, but I write a lot about the dynamic between men and women, and a lot of those instances are things that I've gone through. And so in order for me to make sense of my immediate life, that's where poetry comes in. I would not be able to process it without writing, but specifically without poetry.
So that brings me to the question of, do you consider yourself more of a poet or a spoken word artist, or do you not really place either of the titles on yourself?
I think that I'm both because of the way that I define it. So for me, poetry or being a poet is often the act of writing in the way that, I process it. And so when I think about being an English teacher and all of the poets whose poems I taught to my students, these were not necessarily performance pieces, but they relied on poetic devices in order to convey a message. So depending on what I'm writing, then I'm a poet and it might stop there. It's never meant for the stage. But for spoken word, as I define it, it's really the performance piece. It's really about taking it from the page to the stage, as they say, and making sure that you're connecting with the audience. And there are poems that I'm writing that I don't even want people to read because I feel like the experience of the poem is more powerful than the written existence of the poem, if that makes sense.
It does. What determines the readiness of a poem, or the not worthiness for the stage, but like what determines whether you perform it or if it stays a piece for us to read?
I think that the difference for me usually is in how it sounds to me and how I feel reading it. So if I am reading through a poem and I finish and I say, oh, that's nice, there's some powerful imagery in there, it might be something that I post on my social media pages or save for a book. And one of the distinctions too is that my spoken word pieces are typically much longer. And I know that's not a cut and dry way to determine between the two, but in my life it ends up being that way more often than not. If I am reading a poem to myself and I feel it in my chest or in my gut, or if I can hear how certain poetic devices are enhancing the message and they excite me, then I take it to the stage at least once to see if they also excite others. And if they do, then I kind of put it in my pocket as a performance piece. They can ebb and flow between the two, but that's the way that I've been organizing my work.
And to give a bit of clarity for listeners who might not know what a poetic device is, what is poetic device, right? And how do you use it? And what's your favorite to use?
Indeed, okay. So poetic devices are all the tools that we use to differentiate prose from poetry. And so for poetry, we're talking about creating imagery through your words. We're talking about creating sound and rhythm through your words. So outside of using colorful language in poems, we also use rhyme, whether it's hard rhyme or soft rhyme. We might use alliteration, all of these sound devices that will create it's not necessarily a 3D, but a full experience for our listener, right? So they're not just reading it, but they're feeling it, they're smelling it, they're seeing it. They might be able to feel something because of the texture we create with our words. And so all of those things coming together to create an experience on paper that is not the same as a paragraph. Yeah. And I know that that's not easy for everybody to grasp, but it's the way that I've been able to explain it to some of my poetry students in the past.
That it is a way to play with sounds. What's your favorite way to play with sound?
My favorite way to play with sound is through alliteration, consonants, and parallelism. So what I used to teach my students with persuasive writing is like the power of parallelism. So if you have 3 sentences that all start the same way, you are creating this rhythm that people kind of hold on to. And the best examples of that were Tupac and Martin Luther King Jr. They would begin a sentence the same way, they would grab you with that, and the sentence might end differently, but you got into that rhythm, and you might memorize it or you might memorize the feeling, but it's certainly something that's powerful that I try to mimic in my own writing.
Speaking of Martin Luther King, Tupac, 2 great writers of our time, who else inspires you in that way?
I am inspired by strong female voices. I love me some Martin Luther King. I love me some Malcolm X. I wish I could have met them as well as Tupac. I hold them in a very high regard, just as men who had the power to change the world, and each one of them had their life cut short. So that in and of itself is traumatic. But I'm really inspired by strong female voices. So Sonny Patterson, who was born in Louisiana, my home state, is someone who really inspires me. Her wisdom, her centeredness, and her ability to combine poetry with somewhat of a hip-hop element, at least that's what I get from her. That's not necessarily the brand that she ascribes to, but it just moves me. And I'm often like, I want to write like that. I want to write like that. And then other voices are K-Love the Poet, Emerald Green, Teresa the Songbird. And if you think about all of their delivery, it's very in your face. Some people might, Georgia Me, some people might describe it as aggressive, only because they have this expectation that women are supposed to be soft and dainty. But whenever I see them perform, it inspires me to write more, and it reminds me of the duty that we all have to speak out, to teach, to inspire, to give people a new perspective, or whatever it is that we can do at the moment with our poetry.
What are you trying to do with your poetry?
I am first trying to find my own healing and my own understanding of my world. I remember when I first started doing poetry, I had 2 male poets who happened to be friends pull me aside and ask me, some variation of the question, do you think you're putting yourself in a box by doing all of these relationship poems? And I used to start joking that my poetry was like a 112 or a jagged edge, CD, where all of their songs are about the same thing, but nobody's complaining. They're talking about love, track 1 through 13, but they're all different perspectives of love, and we accept that. So as a female poet, if I want to get up night after night and do a different relationship poem, then that's what I'm going to do, because obviously that's where my spirit is, at the moment. That's what I'm working through. So I think that my voice is definitely in the relationship dynamic. And for me, that is like the male-female dynamic. That's my experience. I write about that. But I think it expands to just the way that we as humans treat one another. So I have poems about my grandmother, poems about my mother and my father, poems about me and my sister, poems about me and my nieces or me and my nephews. I'm consistently looking at how I'm showing up in the world, how people are showing up in my world, and what that means like on a greater level. So it's starting with me. I started off journaling, not writing poetry. My mother and my sister were poets, or at least they had a couple of good ones, right, that they shared with me. And I think it's safe to say that they were poets, but I didn't know the fullness of their poetic life. I think that's a fair way to say it. So I had one poem from my sister, and I had like 1 or 2 from my mom since I was about 5. And I held on to that, but I didn't start writing poetry until middle school. Before then, I was just journaling. And so, of course, if it's my journal, it's about how I feel about my dad not being in my life, about something that happened at school, about something that my mama said, and that's really reflected in my work.
Yeah. So at the end, I like to ask like one thing you would give back to poets, right? But I want for your response to speak directly to Black women, because in the conversation we've had, like that speaks to you a lot. Like seeing Black women and then what that means for you as a Black woman, and then giving that back to the people in your art and things like that. So if you could say one thing to Black women right now, what would it be?
My message to Black women right now is you do not owe anyone your silence. There's this amazing meme that I came across that says Black women will always be too loud in a world that prefers them to be silent. And poetry aside, I've felt that in relationships, I've felt that at work, that as a Black woman, if I am vocal, then I am automatically aggressive. Whereas if a white woman or an Asian woman is vocal, then they are passionate or they are assertive. It's a more positive way to accept their voice and how they show up in the world. And so a lot of times what we do, even subconsciously, is we cower or we create this easily digestible version of ourselves for the world around us and for the men around us. And even thinking about that example of people asking me whether or not I was writing myself into a box instead of honoring that was the message that I had for people at the time. You have to honor the voice inside of you, because if not, it sort of eats you up on the inside, So speak up, speak out. And the same thing that I tell any poet that's first starting, you never know who your message is for, like beyond yourself initially. And so take it to the stage or take it to your friends, take it somewhere and allow whatever that is beautiful and or rough inside of you to be a blessing to somebody else.
How can we support you past this?
So I am Rebecca Dupas everywhere. So right now the social media support is the thing. So you can find me everywhere at Rebecca Dupas. My website as well. I have 2 books of poetry, 4 CDs of poetry, and now I make rings. So you can connect with me everywhere. I think that in the vein of what I just shared with you, the support, I made the joke about social media, but having a platform and being able to be heard, because that is a place where I share my poetry, it's a big deal. So find me there. My name is Rebecca Dupas, and this is Elevate.